Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Oncology Brothers podcast, where our focus is to bridge the gap between academic research and community practice, where most patients are being treated today. I'm Rohit Gosain, alongside my brother and co-host Rahul Gosain.
Good morning, everyone. Our focus today is on yet another FDA approval that we saw in myeloma. As you know, when it comes to plasma cell disorders, this is a broad spectrum from MGUS, where we continue with surveillance, to smoldering myeloma, where there has been a lot of debate on who should get treatment, and then actual multiple myeloma disease, where quad therapy upfront is now the standard of care. Today, we're focusing on smoldering myeloma and the approval of Daratumumab, here based off AQUILA study. For this, we're excited to have the lead author and a world-renowned myeloma specialist, Dr. Vincent Rajkumar. Vincent, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rahul. Thank you, Rohit, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to both of you. I'm happy to answer questions and clarify any doubts about the study and also the field.
Vincent, welcome. We're looking forward to this exciting discussion. Before we go into the specifics of AQUILA study, can you set the stage by defining smoldering myeloma and how to risk stratify this particular entity?
Absolutely. I think the clearest way to think of it is what Rahul was saying. We have MGUS, or monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance, and that's equivalent to a colon polyp. It's a benign pre-malignant condition, but there's a risk of progression 1% per year. And then on the other extreme, you have multiple myeloma, clear malignancy, just like colon cancer, and you need therapy, and without therapy, the disease can take life within a year or two. What Dr. Kyle and Dr. Gripe found in 1980 was there's something in between, didn't fit in either criteria. Patients had more than 10% plasma cells and yet did not have any end organ damage or any serious things. So they termed it smoldering multiple myeloma. And it's differentiated from the MGUS because the risk of progression, rather than being 1% per year, is 10% per year. So that means patients have a 50-50 chance of progression within the first 5 years and need to be watched more closely, counseled so that they're not lost to follow-up. So it's in this context for the last 25 years or so, there have been research going on trying to see is there benefit in treating patients at the smoldering myeloma stage to prevent end organ damage, to prevent progression to myeloma, or at least delay it and improve overall survival. And that's been quite difficult because many studies have been done, but each of them has shown either not enough benefit or more side effects. So this has been going on for a while, and this is kind of the context in which the AQUILA trial takes place.
Vincent, thank you so much for that background. Now, if we were to zoom into smoldering myeloma, even here, not all smoldering myelomas are made equally. You have low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. With all that in mind, can you touch on the AQUILA study design and its findings?
Yes. Early on, many studies started randomizing patients with smoldering myeloma into treatment versus no treatment, usually one drug versus nothing. One of the barriers, besides the lack of efficacy and the side effects, was that smoldering myeloma itself is heterogeneous. Some patients have only a 5% per year risk of progression, and other smoldering patients have like 25% per year risk of progression in the first 2 years. We thought the best way to benefit more patients and not put more patients at risk is to only target the high-risk smoldering multiple myeloma. So the PATHEMA trial with Lendex versus observation, the ECOG trial with Len versus observation, and the AQUILA trial with Daratumumab versus observation focused on what we defined as high-risk smoldering myeloma using what we had the best available criteria. So we would take simple things like, hey, let's look at not just more than 10% plasma cells, but also, let's say, the M spike's also high. If the flow cytometry shows more aberrant cells, if the immunoglobulins are suppressed, if the type of the smoldering is IgA, not IgG. So we use some risk factors to say, who are the people who have a 50-50 chance of progression, not at 5 years, but at 2 years? High-risk smoldering myeloma. And by focusing on them, which is only 1/3 of all smoldering, we felt we could already prevent 2/3 from getting inadvertent early therapy and try to see if we can benefit these people who are at imminent risk of progression. Many of them would not want to wait 2 years to find out. So the AQUILA trial was designed with that and targeted towards high-risk smoldering myeloma. It was designed sometime in the 2013 to 2015 range and started accrual shortly after that, focused on what was defined as high-risk smoldering myeloma and randomized patients to Daratumumab, about 200 people, and observation, which is the standard of care for about 200 people. And the idea was, the primary endpoint was time to multiple myeloma, the active multiple myeloma. Would that be delayed? And then, of course, secondary endpoints will be response rate, overall survival, side effects, and all that. So the main finding is the time to multiple myeloma was significantly prolonged with the Daratumumab. And remember, Daratumumab in the AQUILA trial was not given till progression as it was done in many other myeloma trials. It's for 3 years. It's time-limited duration, and then you stop it. And then we think patients can go on for many years without progression after that. What we found was that 63% were progression-free with Daratumumab compared to only about 41% with the observation arm. I know the slide says time to IMWG slim crab, but it's really time to multiple myeloma. IMWG slim crab is equal to myeloma requiring therapy. So time to what we define as active multiple myeloma was prolonged significantly by using Daratumumab as opposed to just watch and wait. More importantly, one slide that is not here is time to slim crab. Some people, when the criteria were changed in 2014, were still not convinced. It took several years for people to think that these people all need to be treated. So you look at actually time to myeloma therapy, which tells you what physicians would do in actual practice. Even if the patients had myeloma, not everybody got treated. But the time when they actually started myeloma therapy is a beautiful indication of when they all felt something is wrong. And that was at 3 years, only 20% of our Daratumumab patients needed myeloma therapy, as opposed to 40% in the observation arm, exactly double. And that's important because myeloma therapy itself is something patients want to avoid. It carries the connotation of 4-drug therapy, transplant, indefinite maintenance. And so delaying myeloma is good. Delaying myeloma therapy or preventing quite a few patients from needing it is by in and of itself an important endpoint.
Right. We also saw the hint of overall survival here.
Yes. Overall survival was also prolonged. And one of the things to keep in mind with any randomized trial is you set the parameters on when the two arms will be compared head to head for overall survival statistically. The time at which overall survival can be formally compared is not yet there. We have to wait for the events. But even at this stage, there's a 50% reduction in the risk of death. 15 deaths in the Daratumumab arm versus 26 in the observation arm. Many deaths difference is due to progression disease. And then you see that the hazard ratio, 95% confidence interval, doesn't cross 1, suggesting that this will likely be statistically significant if you compare the two arms. But we haven't done that. Right. We are not putting a p-value. We are not calling it statistically significant, but the curves and the hazard ratio, 95% confidence interval, speak for themselves.
Well, Vincent, thanks so much for summarizing all that for us. Impressive results from what we are seeing here. However, quad therapy is rather than standard of care, which we have been utilizing in the United States for some time now. With regards to this being a global study, do we have any idea of what percentage of patients in control arm received anti-CD38 based therapy at the time of progression?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's a minority. There was a letter in the New England Journal that asked that question, and I replied to that as authors in terms of giving all the detailed numbers. The main thing to take home is that if you look at the DARA VRD versus VRD study that we have used to change the standard of care, that's still not showing a survival benefit. So the addition of DARA or not adding DARA impacts the progression-free survival, but the overall survival effect takes a long time to come. I don't think that this difference that's apparent quite early on can be attributed to not having DARA, but rather that there are patients in general practice that you see that you don't enroll in newly diagnosed myeloma trials. When the myeloma happens, the progression can be fast, and those are not patients captured in Perseus or IMRAS or any of the myeloma induction trials. There is a fall-off. There is attrition. Early therapy might prevent patients from going into a state where they are not able to get adequate therapy quick enough to prevent deaths. And I think that may be part of the reflection that you see here.
And the other thing, when we're talking about the study design, Vincent, patients got daratumumab for 3 years. Do we have any hint that 1 year, maybe 2 year was also good enough? Can we use MRD to guide that?
Yes, you don't know. What we did with 3 years was that we felt this is a drug you could take for 3 years, and that would be a reasonable length of time. If we had picked 2 years, someone would have asked us, why not 1 year or why not 4 years? It's arbitrary. In the ongoing ECOG trial, also, it's a time limited therapy for DARA-RD. We are picking these times based on what we think most people can tolerate, what we think might be needed. And in the future, you could use some other endpoints. But I don't think MRD would be a right one because very few patients get MRD negative with daratumumab. So you'll be treating patients for much longer. I don't think that's the endpoint for smoldering unless we move into triplet or quad therapy. You could use some kind of response that is short of MRD to design that. Future trials are asking the question, if AQUILA trial shows, as the previous two PETEMA and ECOG trials, that early intervention with one agent is better than not doing anything, our hypothesis is maybe if you use myeloma-like therapy, you would have a much better effect. If such a situation happens, we would really be looking at MRD and other things as a guide to when to stop therapy. A lot of my controversies are from people who feel like me that you did a randomized trial, you go with what the trial shows. Some people feel we should be treating like myeloma and this is under treatment. I tell them, let's wait for the results. We have the Ithaca trial, we have the Deter SMM that are asking that question. Who knows? They may or may not show benefit. Let's be humble enough and wait for those results. On the other hand, there are people who say we should not treat at all. We should just watch, even though there are trials. For those, I say, if you're not convinced by this trial, there are no trials that have even started to look at no therapy as control arm. It'll be very difficult to do one like that with these results.
And again, Vincent, I think you bring up a big question here. Overtreating or undertreating? Are the benefits outweighing the side effects, be it the financial toxicity or the side effects that are coming along from daratumumab? Or is it better to wait and delay treatment and consider treatment at the time of progression? Can you touch on some of the common side effects we see here and clinical pearls around these for us in our clinical practice?
No, absolutely. I think, first of all, I will tell you, I've done this work for many years doing trials, and I've generally concluded that the trials I've led with thalidomide Zometa versus Zometa or lenalidomide Dex versus Dex are not practice changing because I didn't like the side effect profile as much. There are things that you can consider, particularly lenalidomide, if you don't have access to DARA, but I'm worried about the side effects. With daratumumab, we have a drug that we know from newly diagnosed myeloma trial and 9 other indications that are FDA approved that this is fairly safe in patients who are more advanced disease, more immunosuppressed, and receiving more drugs together in combination. And yet, we don't see major toxicity from that. Given that pre-test probability is how I interpret this trial. I don't look at this one in isolation. I know what happens when you add DARA to VRD, and that's going to immunosuppress patients even more, and what are the risks. And so in that context, if you look at it, any grade 3 or 4 toxicity did occur in 40% of patients who received daratumumab. But if you didn't have a control arm, that would be 40% toxicity. When the control arm has 30%, you know that a certain amount of side effects happen to people, whether they have smoldering myeloma or nothing, right? Because pneumonias happen in life, serious fatigue happens in life, infections, COVID happens in life. So you get those things. And use the control arm and say, okay, yeah, I'm taking on 10% extra absolute grade 3, 4 side effects. Is that risk worth it? And you take it out by, I've reduced progression by half. And then you take that and make a determination of, I feel like this is a favorable risk-benefit profile. As a result, I do think that this study should be considered and discussed with patients. And I think that's why the FDA and EMEA approved the trial. If you look at the main risk with DARA, even in myeloma trials, it's pneumonia. And that's what people get. And thankfully, most of the time, it recovers with antibiotics. And you could probably prevent it with all the appropriate vaccinations and some amount of prophylactic antibiotics in the first month or two. I think you don't want to give everyone antibiotics for 3 years either. So you accept that risk. As you can see here, the serious pneumonia risk is about six-fold higher, but it's 3.5%. It's not that many. I don't think fatal adverse events with DARA change, and that's also seen here. It is a safe drug from that standpoint.
Right, Vincent. Outside of pneumonia, overall, daratumumab is a well-tolerated regimen, but again, 3 years is something that we have to keep in mind that we will be administering this for. Just before we close, Vincent, we recently saw updated results from ASH 2025, where the benefit was seen in all of IMWG 2020 risk group disease as well. Can you touch on this, please?
Absolutely. So, you know what? Risk stratifications evolve. Anytime we publish a risk stratification, the next year there's going to be a new one. You saw there's a new myeloma risk stratification. And so all the high risk myeloma trials will be like, oh, well, you didn't study the high risk myeloma as defined by the IMWG. I wish we could rewind the clock. The IMWG 2220 was developed in 2018, validated in 2019, and published in 2020, by which time the AQUILA trial was well finished accrual. But we have to ask, do the trial results of AQUILA apply to all people who were randomized, or are there people that may not need the daratumumab? And if the IMWG 2220 is indeed a good indicator of benefit, which groups perform better? And so that's what we looked at here, is basically go through the IMWG 2220, apply that to the AQUILA trial, and see what proportion of patients benefited, was their benefit seen. And you can see here that there's benefit definitely in the high risk group by 2220. And that's the group that clearly we have to discuss. That's a third of the smoldering multiple myeloma. They have a 25% chance of progression first 2 years, so that 50% progress within the first 2 years. And in those patients, you can see that the active monitoring arm had a 80% had progressed, 75% had progressed, whereas in the daratumumab arm, only 40% had progressed. And that's where really the impact of the daratumumab early intervention is. Some of the intermediate stage group patients also benefited. And that one, I think you have to be careful because it's all continuous variable. If you have 25% plasma cells, that's also more than 20. So is 50%. So someone who might be intermediate risk by 48% plasma cells and say in the M spike's okay, maybe called intermediate, but I'm not thinking they're intermediate. So we have to use some judgment and look at that. And there are about, I think, I'm not sure, about 15, 20% of AQUILA patients would have been IMWG low risk. And in those patients, potentially you could just watch unless there was some other concern that numerically didn't fit in. We have to take that and then make a decision.
Just before we move on to the closing, to define that risk stratification of 2220 model is bone marrow plasma cells more than 20%, M protein spike of more than 2 gram per deciliter, and free light chain ratio of more than 20.
Correct. Look at the numeric value because 20% light chain ratio is one thing, 95 for the light chain ratio is quite another, and 100 or more we are calling myeloma. So look at the numeric value. What we have done with my colleague Dr. Shaji Kumar and another Mr. Toure is to have a website, myelomarisk.com, in which the actual number can be entered and you get a risk of progression estimate. And that way patients have a true sense from the numbers what to expect. And sometimes it might be much lower, even they call high risk by 2220.
Again, daratumumab is now FDA approved for high-risk smoldering myeloma based off AQUILA study, but at ASH, the update continues to reinforce this now being an option for all subgroups, though majority of the benefit is driven from high risk from IMWG 2020. Vincent, any final thoughts before we close here?
I think this is an exciting time in multiple myeloma. As you saw at ASH, we are making progress. We have had 20 new drugs approved in 20 years. We are making progress. By just combining two drugs, we saw a dramatic difference with teclistamab and DARA, far more than you can anticipate by adding the two drugs. There's synergy, new discoveries being made. And those discoveries will translate to smoldering myeloma. We are being very careful about doing the right trials and not over-interpreting these trials. You need to do a phase 1, phase 2 to move to phase 3. Sometimes people get anxious when they see a phase 2 of a bispecific or a trispecific in smoldering. But trust me, we are not doing that for practice. We are not recommending it for practice. It's to get the hypothesis and see if we can dose modify and use it at the smoldering. I expect studies to come on in smoldering multiple myeloma with immunotherapy. We would do that cautiously in the high risk group with a randomized controlled design and show a clear benefit. Only if we see one like that would we change practice. You're going to see a lot of advances from myeloma trickle down to smoldering, except it takes a long time to show a difference. If I start a study now, it'll read out 10 years from now. So it's a long wait. The good news is there are many trials that have finished accrual waiting to be read out. So they'll keep advances will keep rolling on, and I want patients to keep the faith that we are constantly trying to improve outcome. And final thought is we are not only trying to cure smoldering myeloma, and we are or newly diagnosed, and we are also trying to use the other way around, take lessons from this and see, can we even cure relapse disease? And so cure is the goal, but meanwhile we'll have endpoints of just delaying myeloma.
Vincent, what you just referred to was Majestic-3 and Teclily, all these biospecific antibodies moving in earlier lines, and the data there looks very impressive. Vincent, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and walking us through the recent approval for high-risk smoldering myeloma. For those tuning in, let's go over a recap from today's discussion with Dr. Vincent Rajkumar on the approval of Daratumumab based on Phase 3 AQUILA study for high-risk smoldering myeloma. This study at 5 years showed improved PFS, roughly 63% versus 41%, and improved overall survival, though that's immature right now. Here we're seeing 93% versus 87%. Rohit, your thoughts on today's discussion?
Right, Rahul. One has to keep in mind that this was a global study enrolling 390 patients, and here Daratumumab was given for a total of 3 years. This is not a short time interval, so we have to keep side effects in mind, including financial toxicity. The good part was that we are not seeing a huge risk of side effects, though one has to keep in mind the pneumonia. Yes, shared decision making is important, but we have to guide our patients in making that right decision for them in these settings. Thanks for joining us. Make sure to check out our other discussions around treatment algorithms, conference highlights, and FDA approvals. We are the Oncology Brothers.